I'm proof that Bigfoot territory is not meant to be entered, and the 3 missing fingers on my left hand are evidence no doctor could explain. I was a backcountry surveyor. The kind of professional who spent thousands of hours alone mapping utility corridors through terrain most people will never see. I took contracts other surveyors turned down. Difficult terrain, no road access, weeks of isolation. Then I accepted a job in a drainage where something had already staked its claim. 17-inch footprints appeared in the creek mud. Massive handprints pressed into the dirt outside my tent. My equipment sorted into organized piles while I slept. On the 6th night, I counted them through my tent fabric. 4 massive figures, maybe 5, standing motionless around my camp for hours, not hiding anymore. They let me know I was being watched. Then they let me know what happens when you don't leave. 9 days later, hunters found me hypothermic and delirious with frostbite damage that shouldn't exist in autumn temperatures. Now I've discovered the Forest Service approved another team for the same location, and I'm finally ready to tell what really happened in those woods. Because the question isn't whether Bigfoot exists, it's what they do to people who refuse to leave their territory. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to start this. There's a red light blinking on the camera, and I keep thinking about all the ways this is going to sound crazy. But crazy or not, I need to say it. Someone needs to hear it before they send another crew into that drainage. My name is Dale Everett. I'm 36 years old, and I'm recording this from a storage unit in Boise that I've been renting for the past 11 months. I sleep here more nights than I don't. The boxes you see behind me, I haven't unpacked them. I won't. Unpacking means settling somewhere, and settling means staying in one place long enough for the nightmares to find a permanent address. 18 months ago, I was a different person. I had an apartment with actual furniture. I had a career I was proud of. I had a way of looking at the world that made sense. Cause and effect, observable phenomena, rational explanations for everything. I was the guy who rolled his eyes at campfire stories. The guy who told people there's nothing in the woods that isn't in a biology textbook. I need you to understand who I was before, so you understand what it means that I'm sitting here now, hands shaking, trying to warn you about something I still don't have a name for. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment. I've been in firefights. I've seen things that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. When I came home, I took all that training, the navigation, the survival skills, the ability to stay calm when everything goes sideways, and I put it to work as a backcountry surveyor. 15 years of solo work in some of the most remote terrain in the western United States. I've been dropped into places where the nearest human being was 50 miles away, and I've never once felt like I couldn't handle whatever the wilderness threw at me. That's not arrogance. That's just experience. Thousands of hours alone in the backcountry teaches you what's actually dangerous and what's just your imagination. I learned to trust my senses, trust my training, trust the gear on my back. I learned that fear is usually just unfamiliarity, and unfamiliarity goes away once you've spent enough time in a place. I was wrong. I'm recording this because 3 weeks ago, I found out the Forest Service quietly approved a new survey team for the same utility corridor where I nearly died. Same drainage, same 12-day timeline, same helicopter drop with no ground vehicle access. They're scheduled to begin work this spring, and nobody told them what happened to the last surveyor they sent in there. The official incident report, I obtained it through a Freedom of Information Act request, took me 8 months. Says I experienced environmental exposure, and possible psychological episode brought on by isolation. 6 weeks in the hospital, 3 of them in intensive care. 3 fingers on my left hand amputated due to frostbite. Frostbite. In September, when the daytime temperatures never dropped below 50 degrees. I'm not asking you to believe me. I gave up on being believed somewhere around the 4th time I told this story and watched someone's expression shift from sympathy to something that looked a lot like pity for the crazy person. What I'm asking is simpler than belief. I'm asking you to be careful. I'm asking anyone who might be part of that new survey team to understand that there are places in this country where we are not welcome, where something lives that doesn't want us there and has ways of making that very clear. The locals call that drainage the deadfall. I didn't ask why at the time. I should have. I'm going to tell you everything that happened, from the day I took the contract to the day they pulled me out of those woods more dead than alive. I'm going to tell you about the silence and the tracks and the smell. I'm going to tell you about the night I woke up surrounded by things that weren't trees, and then you can decide for yourself what to do with it. The contract came through in late August of 2019. Premium pay for a 12-day solo job mapping a proposed utility corridor through the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest in north-central Idaho. The money was good, almost double my usual rate, and when I asked why, the coordinator just said it was a remote drop with difficult terrain. No road access, helicopter insertion and extraction only. The kind of job that makes most surveyors turn the page and look for something easier. For me, it sounded perfect. 12 days alone in country I'd never worked before, nothing but my equipment and the mountains. I'd done dozens of jobs like it. This one didn't seem any different. I flew into Lewiston and drove a rental up to Elk City, a small town that serves as the last supply point before you head into the backcountry. Population of maybe 500, one main street, a general store that sells everything from ammunition to canned beans. I needed to top off a few supplies, extra batteries, some freeze-dried meals, a new water filter, so I stopped in the afternoon before my scheduled helicopter pickup the next morning. The store was quiet. A couple of older men sat near the register, the kind of retired locals you find in every small mountain town, drinking coffee and watching whoever walks through the door. I nodded to them, went about my business, found what I needed. When I brought my items to the counter, the woman running the register asked where I was headed. I told her. Utility corridor survey up in the National Forest. Helicopter drop at the North Ridge. 12 days of solo work mapping the proposed route. The silence that followed was the first warning I should have paid attention to. One of the old-timers, I'd learn later his name was Lyle, a retired timber cruiser who'd spent 40 years working those mountains, set down his coffee cup and looked at me for a long moment. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "That drainage," he said. "The one they're calling the deadfall." I said yes. That was the one. He nodded slowly, like I'd just confirmed something he'd been hoping wasn't true. "Crews don't come back the same from up there," he said. "Some don't come back at all." I smiled, not unkindly, but I'd heard this kind of thing before. Every remote wilderness has its legends. People who've lived their whole lives in the shadow of the mountains tend to project things onto the forest, make sense of its indifference by giving it a personality, a malevolence. It's human nature. "I appreciate the warning," I told him. "But I've been doing this work for 15 years. I'll be fine." Lyle didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me. He just watched my face for a moment, then nodded and went back to his coffee. "Suit yourself, son," he said. The woman at the register rang me up without another word. When I left, I could feel them watching me through the window, and I remember thinking how strange it was, that look on their faces. Not concern, exactly. Something more like resignation, like they'd played out this same scene before and already knew how it ended. The helicopter picked me up at 0700 the next morning. 45 minutes later, I was standing on a ridgeline above the deadfall drainage with 12 days of supplies, my surveying equipment, and the unshakable confidence of a man who'd never encountered anything his training couldn't explain. I watched the helicopter disappear over the ridge, listened to the rotor noise fade until there was nothing left but wind in the trees. I was alone, and I had no idea what was already watching me. The first day was exactly what I expected. Hard work, beautiful country, nothing out of the ordinary. I set up my base camp on the ridgeline where the helicopter dropped me. Good sight lines, flat ground, a small creek about 200 yards downslope for water. Standard protocol. I spent the morning organizing my equipment and getting my bearings, then started the actual survey work in the afternoon. The terrain was steep and heavily timbered, old-growth cedar and hemlock with a thick understory of ferns and deadfall. Difficult to move through, but nothing I hadn't handled before. By the end of that first day, I'd mapped about 1.5 miles of the proposed corridor. I cooked dinner as the sun went down, made my scheduled radio check with the contract coordinator back in Lewiston, and crawled into a tent feeling good about the work ahead. The forest was quiet. The stars were bright. I slept like the dead. Day 2 is when I noticed the first wrongness. I was working my way down into the main drainage, taking measurements and marking waypoints, when the forest went silent. And I don't mean quiet. I mean silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Nothing. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. I stopped walking and just stood there, listening. The silence lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then everything came back at once. The birds, the bugs, the normal ambient noise of a living forest. I wrote it off as one of those things. Maybe a predator had moved through nearby. Maybe a hawk passed overhead, and everything went still. There are explanations for moments like that. But it happened again that afternoon, and again the next morning. Each time, the silence would descend without warning, hold for anywhere from 20 seconds to a full minute, and then release. Each time I found myself frozen in place, straining to hear something that never came. That same day, day 2, I found the track. I was following a game trail down to the creek to refill my water bottles when I saw it pressed into the mud at the water's edge. A footprint, barefoot, humanoid, and massive. I measured it with my surveyor's tape, 17 inches long, about 7 inches across at the ball. The toes were clearly defined, and there were visible ridge patterns in the impression, dermal ridges, like fingerprints. I photographed it from every angle. I told myself it was a bear track, distorted by the water and the soft mud. I knew bear anatomy well enough to know that didn't make sense. Bears don't have that toe structure, don't leave that kind of heel impression. But I needed an explanation I could accept, so I accepted that one. I almost believed it. Almost. Day 3 brought the logs. I'd planned my route the night before using my topographic maps, identifying the most efficient path to continue the survey work. But when I reached the draw I'd intended to cross, I found it blocked. A dozen trees had fallen across the passage, interlocked in a way that looked almost deliberate. The pattern was too geometric, too organized. Natural windfall doesn't arrange itself like that. Trunks crossing at right angles, branches interlaced like fingers. I stood there for a long time studying the arrangement. Then I told myself what I needed to tell myself. Storms do strange things. Microburst winds can drop trees in patterns that look intentional. There's always an explanation if you look hard enough. I rerouted and pushed deeper into the drainage, adding 2 hours to my workday. That night, I sat by my small camp stove and realized something had shifted in the texture of the forest around me. I couldn't name it then. I can barely name it now. The woods felt different. Not hostile exactly. More like aware. Like something had noticed I was there. I understand now what was happening during those first 3 days. I didn't understand it then. Couldn't have understood it. But looking back, the pattern is unmistakable. I was being herded. Every route I planned to take became impassable. Every path that would have led me back toward the ridgeline or out toward the forest road to the east was somehow blocked. Rock slides that looked fresh, with dust still settling on the stones. Log arrangements like the one I'd found on day 3, appearing overnight across trails that had been clear the evening before. Game trails that seemed to have been deliberately obscured. The brush pushed across them in ways that didn't match any animal behavior I knew. At the time, I rationalized each obstacle individually. Bad luck, coincidence. Difficult terrain doing what difficult terrain does. But I was making decisions based on what routes were available to me. And those available routes all led in the same direction. Deeper into the drainage. Deeper into the deadfall. Whatever lived in those woods was pushing me where it wanted me to go. And I walked right into it, thinking I was navigating on my own terms. Day 3 is also when I first encountered the smell. I was skirting the edge of a steep draw, looking for a crossing point, when it hit me. A thick, organic rot that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Not the clean decay of forest decomposition, but something glandular and alive. Like a dead animal mixed with musk, mixed with something I can't describe because I've never smelled anything else like it. My stomach lurched immediately. Not just discomfort, real nausea, the kind that doubles you over. I stumbled backward, away from the draw, and the smell faded. When I tried to approach from a different angle, it returned, stronger this time, driving me back. I didn't cross that draw. I rerouted again, adding another detour to a day already full of them. That night, I made my radio check and said nothing about what I'd experienced. How could I? Hey, I found some weird logs and smelled something bad. Doesn't exactly constitute an emergency. I was still telling myself there were rational explanations for everything. The alternative, that something was deliberately manipulating my movements, using blockades and territorial scent to push me in a specific direction, was too absurd to consider. But I was starting to feel it. That sense of being watched from distances I couldn't pinpoint. Moments when I'd spin around, certain someone was behind me, and find nothing but trees and shadow. The weight of attention I couldn't see, but couldn't ignore. I've been in combat. I know what it feels like to be in someone's crosshairs, to know you're being observed by something that wishes you harm. This was different. There was no hostility in it, not yet. More like curiosity, assessment. Something was watching me move through its territory, and it was deciding what to do about it. I remember sitting by my tent that night, my headlamp off to save battery, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. The forest was quiet, but it wasn't the dead silence I'd experienced during the day. Normal sounds, normal night. I told myself I was imagining things. Isolation can do that. I knew that from my training. The human mind doesn't like being alone in wild places. It invents threats to explain its own unease. But deep down, in a part of my brain I wasn't ready to listen to yet, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone out there. And whatever was watching me had been watching since the moment the helicopter flew away. Day 4 is when I should have called for extraction. I know that now. I knew it then somewhere in the back of my mind, but I couldn't admit it to myself. Admitting it would mean acknowledging that something was happening out there that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The day started wrong. I woke before dawn with that familiar feeling of being watched, stronger than before. I lay in my sleeping bag for a long time, listening to the forest, waiting for something I couldn't name. When I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was my food cache. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. But the containers had been moved. I'd arranged them in a specific pattern the night before. It's a habit from years of solo work, a way to tell at a glance if anything's been disturbed. 3 bear canisters in a triangle, with my cook kit in the center. When I came out that morning, the canisters were still there, still sealed, but they'd been rearranged into a line. And beside them, pressed into the soft earth next to my tent, was a handprint. I measured it. I couldn't help myself. Palm width, just over 8 inches. Finger length from base to tip, nearly 6 inches. The proportions were wrong for a human hand. The palm too wide, the fingers too long, but the structure was unmistakably humanoid. 5 fingers, visible knuckle creases, dermal ridges in the palm, like the ones I'd seen in the footprint by the creek. I photographed it from every angle, my hands trembling slightly in the morning cold. Then I tried to work. I couldn't focus. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow in my peripheral vision sent my heart racing. I covered maybe half a mile of the survey corridor before I gave up and returned to camp early, telling myself I was just tired, just needed rest. That evening, at dusk, I heard the first knock. It came from somewhere to the northeast, a deep, resonant impact, like someone striking a baseball bat against a hollow tree. The sound echoed across the drainage and faded into silence. I froze, listening. Then an answering knock came from the west. Different tone, different distance, but the same deliberate quality. Then another from the south. I counted at least 3 distinct sources, maybe 4. They weren't random. There was a rhythm to them, a call and response pattern that felt too purposeful to be coincidence, too organized to be falling timber or woodpeckers. These were communications. Something was talking to something else across that drainage, and I was standing in the middle of their conversation. The knocking continued for about 15 minutes, moving around the perimeter of what I now understood was their territory. Then it stopped, and the forest went quiet. Not the dead silence I'd experienced before, but a watchful stillness. Waiting. I made my scheduled radio check that night at 1900 hours. The contract coordinator asked how the work was going, if I needed anything. I said everything was fine, on schedule, no problems. I don't know why I lied. Pride, maybe. Fear of sounding crazy. Or maybe some part of me still believed there was a rational explanation for all of it. and I just needed one more day to figure out what it was. That night, I slept with my sidearm next to my pillow. I woke repeatedly to sounds at the edge of perception, movement in the brush, a branch snapping, something heavy shifting its weight just beyond the tree line. Each time I lay still in the darkness, barely breathing, straining to hear. Each time the sounds faded before I could locate them. By morning I was exhausted. I hadn't really slept in 2 days, and I was starting to understand something I didn't want to understand. Whatever was out there, whatever had left that handprint, made those knocks, watched me from distances I couldn't see. It wasn't afraid of me. It was studying me. Day 5, I decided to fight back the only way I knew how. I decided to document everything. Looking back, I think that decision might have been what pushed things over the edge. Up until then, I was just another trespasser in their territory. An annoyance to be herded and warned and eventually driven out. But when I started actively trying to capture evidence of their existence, I became something else. A threat. I spent the morning photographing everything. The handprint by my tent, which was still visible despite a light rain overnight. The blocked trails and log arrangements I'd been rerouting around for days, and the stone structures I was only now beginning to notice throughout the drainage. They were everywhere, once I started looking. Cairns stacked in ways that didn't match any human trail marking system I'd ever seen. Stones balanced on top of each other in arrangements that seemed to defy gravity. Rocks placed in patterns I couldn't read, but felt certain meant something. I photographed all of it. Dozens of images on my primary camera, backup shots on my phone. Then I set up my trail camera, a motion-activated unit I'd brought for documenting wildlife in the survey corridor, and pointed it directly at my food cache before heading out for the day's work. If something came into my camp again, I was going to have evidence. When I returned at dusk, the trail camera had been moved. It was still mounted on the same tree, still powered on, but it had been rotated to face the trunk instead of my camp. The angle was precise, deliberate. Whoever, whatever, had done it hadn't knocked the camera down or broken it. They'd simply turned it away, like closing a door. My hands were shaking when I pulled the SD card from my primary camera to review the day's photographs. The card reader on my laptop recognized the device but couldn't access the files. Every image was corrupted beyond recovery. Hundreds of photographs, the handprint, the structures, the blocked trails, all gone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the error messages on my screen. Then I remembered my phone. The backup images were mostly intact. Most of them showed exactly what I remembered photographing. Rock formations, log arrangements, the handprint with my measuring tape beside it. But there was one image I didn't remember taking. It was a shot of the tree line at the edge of a clearing I'd passed through that afternoon. The lighting was dim, the focus slightly off, the kind of image you get when you accidentally trigger the camera while adjusting your grip. But in the background, partially obscured by a thick cedar trunk, there was something standing. A dark mass. Taller than the surrounding brush. Roughly humanoid in shape. I zoomed in as far as my phone would allow. The resolution fell apart into pixels and shadows. It could have been a stump. It could have been a trick of light. It could have been my imagination filling in shapes where none existed. But I knew what I was looking at. And I think I knew in that moment that I was no longer just being watched. I was being warned. Day 6 started with a decision I should have made days earlier. I was going to pack up and hike out. I'd finally admitted to myself that something was deeply wrong in that drainage. The corrupted camera files, the deliberately moved trail camera, that image on my phone of something standing in the trees. I couldn't rationalize any of it anymore. Whatever was happening out there was beyond my understanding, and I'd lost my appetite for trying to understand it. I started breaking down my camp at first light. I'd call for an early extraction once I reached higher ground, where the satellite phone had better reception. I'd tell the contract coordinator there was a safety concern with the terrain, something vague enough to be professional. I'd take the hit to my reputation if I had to. I just wanted out. That's when the smell came back. It rolled into camp like a fog, thick and suffocating, the same glandular rot I'd encountered near that draw on day 3, but stronger now, much stronger. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself was exhaling something dead and alive at the same time. My eyes watered. My stomach heaved. I stumbled away from my half-packed gear, trying to find clean air, but there was no escaping it. I moved north. The smell followed. I turned east. It was there too, maybe even stronger. Every direction I tried, the stench materialized to block me. I was being contained, penned in. Whatever lived in these woods didn't want me to leave. Not yet, not on my terms. I gave up on packing and retreated to my tent, pulling my shirt over my nose and mouth, breathing through the fabric. The smell lingered for hours, fading gradually as the afternoon wore on, but never completely disappearing. It clung to my clothes, my gear, the inside of my nostrils. Even now, 18 months later, I sometimes wake up with that smell in my nose and have to convince myself it isn't real. By late afternoon, the stench had faded enough that I could function. I tried again to break camp, moving quickly, not bothering to organize my gear properly, just stuffing everything into my pack with shaking hands. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline. I had maybe 2 hours of usable daylight left. I didn't make it. The scream came just as the shadows started to lengthen. I don't know how to describe it. I've tried 100 times, and the words never capture what I heard. The closest I can get is this. Imagine a woman screaming in absolute terror, the kind of sound a human throat makes when there's nothing left but pure animal fear. Now run that scream through a dying engine, something mechanical grinding itself apart. Layer those sounds together until you can't tell where the organic ends and the mechanical begins. That's what I heard echoing across the drainage as the sun went down. It came from everywhere and nowhere. The acoustics of the terrain bounced it around until I couldn't locate a source. It might have been a quarter mile away. It might have been 100 yards. I stood frozen with my pack half on my shoulders, listening to that sound reverberate through the trees, and something in my hindbrain, something older than language, older than thought, told me to stop moving. So I stopped. I soon set down my pack. I crawled into my tent. I drew my sidearm and sat there in the growing darkness, the .40 caliber pistol in my lap, knowing with absolute certainty that it was useless. Whatever had made that sound, whatever had been hurting me through this drainage for nearly a week, was not something I could fight. The scream came twice more before full dark. Each time it seemed closer. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the darkness with my weapon drawn, listening to the forest, waiting for something I couldn't see to make its next move. I didn't have to wait long. I need to stop for a second. This is the part I haven't told anyone. Not the Forest Service investigator. Not the doctors at the hospital. Not even my brother. and he's the only family I have left. I've started to tell it a dozen times, and every time the words just stop. But I'm telling it now. Because if that new survey crew goes into the deadfall without knowing what's waiting for them, I'll have to live with that. And I can't. It was sometime after 2 in the morning. I know because I'd been checking my watch compulsively, counting the hours until dawn like a child counting down to Christmas. Except instead of presents, I was waiting for enough light to run. I must have dozed off at some point. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up. Something was different. The quality of the darkness had changed, or the pressure of the air, or something I can't name but could feel in my bones. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, my hand resting on my sidearm, and I listened. The forest was silent. Not the normal quiet of a sleeping wilderness, but that absolute silence I'd experienced before. The kind where even the insects go mute. The kind that means something has frightened every living thing into stillness. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head to look at the wall of my tent. The fabric was thin enough to show silhouettes when there was moonlight or starlight behind them. I'd pitched the tent in a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, with trees ringing the perimeter. I knew those trees. I'd studied them every night before sleep, memorizing their shapes, their positions. The shapes were wrong. There were too many of them, and they were in the wrong places. I stopped breathing. I lay there, lungs burning, staring at the silhouettes pressed against the fabric of my tent, and I watched one of them shift its weight. Trees don't shift their weight. I counted them. 4, maybe 5. It was hard to tell where one shadow ended and another began. They stood at the edges of the clearing, spaced evenly around my camp, massive and motionless. Each one had to be 7 feet tall at minimum, probably closer to 8. Broad across the shoulders. Bipedal. Unmistakably not human, but close enough to human that my brain kept trying to make them fit into that category and failing. They were watching me. I don't know how I knew that. I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see faces, just those massive dark shapes silhouetted against the stars. But I could feel their attention like a physical weight. They knew I was awake. They knew I was watching them, and they wanted me to know they were there. I did not move for the next 7 hours. I did not reach for my weapon. I did not make a sound. I breathed in shallow sips, small enough that my chest barely rose, and I watched those figures stand motionless in the darkness like monuments to something I couldn't understand. Sometime before dawn, I must have blinked. When I opened my eyes, the silhouettes were gone. Just like that. No sound of movement. No rustling in the brush. One moment they were there, and the next they weren't. When the first gray light finally came, I told myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Isolation psychosis, sleep deprivation, the human mind playing tricks in the dark. Then I stepped outside my tent and saw what they'd left behind. My camp looked like a crime scene. The first thing I noticed was the food cache. The 3 bear canisters I'd arranged so carefully were scattered across the clearing, lids removed, contents sorted into piles. Not scattered randomly, sorted. The freeze-dried meals were in one group, the energy bars in another, the trail mix and nuts in a third. Some items had been taken. Others had been opened, examined, and deliberately left behind. I stood there in the gray morning light, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't the work of a bear. Bears don't sort. Bears don't categorize. Bears tear things apart and eat whatever they can find. This was something else entirely. Something that had taken its time. Something that had been curious. My GPS unit was next. I found it about 10 feet from my tent, stomped flat. The housing was cracked, the screen shattered, the internal circuitry visible through the broken casing. Whatever had done this hadn't just stepped on it accidentally. The force required to crush that unit was deliberate, calculated, a message. My stomach dropped as I realized what was missing. The satellite phone. I searched the immediate area, my movements becoming increasingly frantic. It wasn't in my tent. It wasn't in my pack. It wasn't anywhere in the clearing. Without that phone, I had no way to call for extraction, no way to reach the contract coordinator, no way to tell anyone where I was or what was happening. I found it 200 yards from camp, at the base of a massive cedar. The phone had been bitten nearly in half. I picked it up with shaking hands and stared at the damage. The bite marks were clear, deep punctures in the plastic housing, the kind of pressure that would require a jaw strength I couldn't comprehend. The battery was gone, probably swallowed. The circuit board was destroyed. Even if I could somehow repair it, there was nothing left to repair. I sat down on a fallen log and tried to think. No GPS, no satellite phone, no way to call for help. My primary camera's memory card was corrupted. My trail camera had been deliberately turned away, and the only evidence I had left was whatever remained on my phone, including that one image of something standing in the trees that I still couldn't fully explain. I was 6 days into a 12-day contract, deep in a drainage I'd been herded into against my will, surrounded by something that had just demonstrated it could enter my camp at any time, examine my belongings with apparent intelligence, and destroy my ability to navigate or communicate. The message was unmistakable. You are not leaving on your terms. I sat there for a long time, trying to quiet the panic rising in my chest. I was trained for situations like this. Survival, evasion, navigation. I'd done courses, run exercises, spent years preparing for the moment when everything went wrong, and I had to rely on nothing but my own skills. But none of that training had prepared me for this. None of it had accounted for something that could think, could plan, could systematically dismantle my ability to escape while I lay paralyzed with fear just 30 feet away. I pulled out my topographic maps. Paper, thank God. Something they couldn't corrupt or crush, and tried to orient myself. The ridgeline where the helicopter had dropped me was roughly northwest. If I could make it back there, I might be able to signal for help. Worst case, the extraction was scheduled for day 12 regardless. I just had to survive 6 more days. I started packing what was left of my gear. I didn't know it yet, but the herding wasn't over. They weren't done with me, and the next 3 days would make everything that came before feel like a warning. I should have heeded. Day 7. The day I stopped being observed and started being hunted. I broke camp at first light, leaving behind anything I couldn't carry easily. The surveying equipment, the ruined electronics, most of my food. I took only what I needed to move fast. Water filter, emergency blanket, the remaining energy bars, my sidearm. I stuffed the topographic maps into my jacket pocket where I could reach them quickly. My plan was simple. Head northwest toward the ridgeline. Stay on high ground where possible, and make as much distance as I could before dark. If I pushed hard, I might be able to cut 2 days off the hike and reach a point where another survey team or a ranger patrol might spot me. The plan fell apart within the first hour. Every route I tried was blocked. Game trails I remembered from earlier in the week had been obscured, brush piled across them in ways that looked deliberate. A creek crossing I'd used on day 2 was now dammed with logs. The water backed up into an impassable marsh. A ridgeline I'd intended to follow was blocked by a fresh rock slide, the stones still settling. I kept telling myself it was coincidence. Bad luck. The forest doing what forests do. But by midday, I couldn't pretend anymore. I was being herded again, pushed in a direction I didn't choose, away from the extraction point, deeper into the drainage. And now I could hear them. Not the silence this time. Movement. Deliberate, heavy footsteps in the timber, always just beyond my line of sight. Branches snapping. The occasional thud of something large shifting its weight. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted me to know they were there. The screaming vocalization came around 2 in the afternoon. It erupted from somewhere to my left, that same mechanical organic shriek I'd heard the night before. A woman screaming through a dying engine. Rage and warning compressed into a sound that didn't belong in any natural world. I froze mid-step, my hand dropping to my sidearm, knowing even as I touched it that the gesture was meaningless. An answering scream came from my right, then another from behind me. They were coordinating, communicating, driving me forward like hunters driving game toward a trap. And I had no choice but to move in the direction they allowed, because every other path was blocked by sounds that promised something worse than whatever lay ahead. I don't know how many miles I covered that day. I don't know where I was on the map. I'd lost all sense of position, all ability to navigate. I just moved, stumbling through the brush, following the only routes that weren't blocked by rock slides or screams, or that suffocating rot smell that materialized whenever I strayed too far in the wrong direction. By nightfall, I was completely lost. I found a depression between 2 fallen logs and crawled into it, pulling my emergency blanket over me, making myself as small as possible. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The sounds of movement circled my position all night, close enough that I could smell them. That thick, glandular stench that had become as familiar as my own fear. They knew exactly where I was, and they were waiting for something I couldn't understand. I need to be honest with you about something. My memory of days 7 and 8 is broken, fragmented. There are stretches of time I can't account for, moments that blur together, and gaps where hours simply vanish. The doctors at the hospital said this was consistent with severe dehydration and hypothermia. The Forest Service investigator suggested it was evidence of a psychological episode. Maybe they're right. Maybe the human brain just shuts down when it encounters something it can't process. But I'm going to tell you what I remember, even the parts that don't make sense, especially the parts that don't make sense. I remember running, not jogging, not hiking fast, running. Crashing through underbrush, branches whipping my face, lungs burning. I remember the screaming vocalization coming from somewhere behind me, that mechanical organic shriek that seemed to push me forward like a physical force. I remember falling, getting up, falling again. I remember looking back once and seeing movement in the timber, something large, something fast, something that moved through the dense forest like it wasn't even there. I remember the creek. I don't know which creek. I'd lost all sense of position by then. Couldn't have found myself on a map if my life depended on it. I stumbled down a steep bank and fell into the water, and here's what I can't explain. I couldn't feel the cold. September in the Idaho backcountry, mountain-fed streams running maybe 45 degrees, and I couldn't feel it. I stood in that water up to my waist and felt nothing. My body had stopped reporting sensations that didn't serve immediate survival. I remember the hunter's blind, a collapsed structure, maybe 50 yards from the creek. Old canvas stretched over a rotting frame, half buried in dead leaves. It must have been abandoned for years. I crawled inside and pulled the canvas over me, making myself as small as possible, and I stayed there. I don't know how long, hours, maybe a full day. Time stopped meaning anything. I remember waking up, though I don't remember falling asleep, to the sound of breathing. Something was outside the blind. Close. So close I could smell it through the rotting canvas, that thick glandular stench that had become the signature of everything wrong in those woods. The breathing was slow, rhythmic, impossibly deep, the kind of lung capacity that doesn't belong to anything in a biology textbook. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there in the darkness, listening to that massive presence just inches away, and I made a decision that probably saved my life. I played dead. Not consciously, there was nothing conscious about it. Something ancient in my hindbrain took over. The same instinct that makes prey animals go limp when a predator's jaws close around them. I let my body go slack. I let my breathing become shallow and irregular. I became nothing, nobody, not worth the effort. The breathing continued for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, it receded. When I finally dared to move again, I looked at my left hand. My fingers were white, waxy, the color of candle tallow, completely bloodless from the second knuckle up. I couldn't feel them. I tried to flex them and got nothing. No movement, no sensation, nothing. Frostbite. In September, when the daytime temperatures hadn't dropped below 50 degrees the entire week. I still can't explain it. The doctors couldn't explain it. The official report doesn't even try to explain it, just documents the injury and moves on, as if unexplained frostbite in late summer is a normal occurrence that doesn't require investigation. I remember crawling out of that blind sometime later, morning maybe, or afternoon. I couldn't tell. I remember stumbling through the forest with no direction, no plan, just the desperate animal need to keep moving. I remember the sounds of pursuit fading behind me, the screaming vocalizations becoming more distant, as if whatever had been hurting me was finally letting me go. I remember thinking, they're done with me. I didn't know why. I still don't. On day 9, though I didn't know it was day 9, I heard voices. Human voices. The first human sounds I'd heard since the helicopter flew away, since I stood on that ridgeline with my unshakable confidence and watched my lifeline disappear over the trees. I was moving through a stand of aspens, barely upright, my left hand cradled against my chest. I'd stopped looking at my fingers because looking at them made it real, and I couldn't afford real right now. I could only afford forward. The voices came from somewhere ahead, men talking, the clink of metal, the specific sounds of people who belonged in these woods. Hunters. I tried to call out, but my throat was so dry that nothing came. I stumbled toward the sounds, crashing through the brush with no attempt at stealth. Somewhere in my broken mind, I understood that making noise was good now. Making noise meant they'd find me. They almost shot me. I learned this later, when one of them admitted it while we waited for the helicopter. He'd seen movement in the underbrush, something coming toward their camp, and he'd raised his rifle before his partner grabbed the barrel and pushed it down. "That ain't an elk," his partner had said. "That's a man." I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. Hands on my shoulders, someone giving me water. Voices asking questions I couldn't answer. I remember trying to tell them what day it was, and they looked at me with expressions I couldn't read. "Son," one of them said, "it's September 12th. You've been out here 9 days. I thought it was day 7. I'd lost 2 full days somewhere in those fragmented memories, somewhere between the creek and the hunter's blind and the sound of breathing outside the canvas. They radioed for extraction immediately. Forest Service frequency, emergency protocol. One of them stayed with me while the others packed up their camp, and he kept looking at me like he was trying to figure something out. "Where'd you come from?" he asked finally. "Which direction?" I pointed vaguely behind me toward the drainage I'd been pushed through for the past week. He went quiet. Then he exchanged a look with one of his partners, the kind of look that carries a whole conversation in a single glance. Nobody said anything about what that look meant, but I understood it anyway. They knew. Maybe not the specifics, but they knew something about that drainage, that territory. They knew enough to be afraid of it. The helicopter came within 2 hours, Forest Service, just like my original extraction was supposed to be. When the rangers loaded me aboard, I watched their faces as one of the hunters explained where they'd found me. The lead ranger's expression didn't change, but his partner, younger, less experienced, muttered something under his breath. "Another one." The lead ranger shot him a look that could have cut glass. The younger man went silent, suddenly very interested in checking my vitals. Nobody asked me what happened. Not during the flight, not during the transfer to the ambulance that met us at the ranger station. It was like they already knew, or at least knew enough that they didn't want to hear the details. I spent the flight staring at my left hand, watching the white fingers that wouldn't move, wondering what else I'd lost out there in the deadfall. I wouldn't learn the full extent of the damage for weeks. I woke up in the ICU at St. Joseph Regional Medical Center in Lewiston, and for a long moment I didn't know where I was. White ceiling, fluorescent lights, the steady beep of monitors, the smell of antiseptic, so clean and sharp it made my eyes water after days of breathing nothing but forest air and that other smell, the one I was trying very hard not to think about. A nurse noticed I was awake and called for a doctor. Within minutes, there were people around my bed asking questions. "What's your name? Do you know where you are? Can you tell me what day it is?" I answered as best I could, my voice coming out in a dry rasp that didn't sound like me. They told me I'd been unconscious for almost 2 days. Severe dehydration, hypothermia, malnutrition. My body had been shutting down by the time the helicopter reached Lewiston. Another few hours in the field, and I probably wouldn't have made it. Then they told me about my hand. I already knew, of course. I'd seen my fingers turn white and waxy in that hunter's blind, felt them go numb and refuse to respond. But there's a difference between knowing something and hearing a doctor explain it in clinical terms. 3 fingers on my left hand, index, middle, and ring, were beyond saving. The tissue was dead, had been dead for longer than the exposure should have allowed. They would need to amputate. I asked how that was possible. September in Idaho, temperatures in the 50s during the day, maybe low 40s at night. I'd been wet from the creek, yes, but not for long enough to cause this kind of damage. The doctor shook his head and said he couldn't explain it. Sometimes the body does things that don't make sense. Sometimes injuries happen that shouldn't happen. I spent 3 weeks in the ICU. The amputation surgery went well, if you can call losing 3 fingers going well. The stumps healed cleanly. The physical therapists were optimistic about my ability to adapt. Everyone was very professional, very kind, very careful not to ask what had actually happened out there. The Forest Service investigator was different. He showed up on day 4, after I'd been moved out of intensive care but before the amputation. A man in his 50s, gray hair, the kind of face that's learned not to show much. He introduced himself and explained that he was conducting a standard incident investigation. Anytime someone gets injured or goes missing in national forest land, they have to document what happened. I told him everything. I don't know why. Maybe because I was still doped up on painkillers, or because I'd spent so many days alone with what had happened that I needed to say it out loud, or because some part of me still believed that if I just explained it clearly enough, someone would understand. I told him about the silence, the tracks, the 17-inch footprint with visible dermal ridges. I told him about the blocked trails and the geometric log arrangements, and the smell that materialized whenever I tried to go somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. I told him about the wood knocks and the screaming vocalization and that image on my phone of something standing in the trees. I told him about the night they surrounded my camp, the 7 hours of paralysis, the figures that stood motionless at the edges of my clearing, so still I could only tell they were alive when one of them shifted its weight and blocked the starlight behind it. I told him about my GPS being crushed and my satellite phone being bitten in half, and the systematic way they'd sorted through my food cache, taking some items and leaving others like they were making deliberate choices. I told him about the pursuit, the lost time, the frostbite that shouldn't have been possible. I told him everything, and I watched his face while I did it. At first, he was patient, nodding along, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. What time did you first notice the blocked trail? Can you estimate the size of the handprint? How many distinct vocalizations did you hear? But as I kept talking, something changed. The questions became different, less about what happened and more about how I was feeling when it happened. Was I sleeping well before the incident? Had I ever experienced hallucinations before? Was there a history of mental illness in my family? He was guiding me toward an explanation I couldn't accept. By the end of the second interview, he came back 3 days later after my surgery. I could see exactly where this was going. I was going to be written off. The crazy surveyor who lost his mind in the wilderness and made up a story about monsters to explain his own breakdown. It didn't matter what I'd seen. It didn't matter what I could prove. The institution had already decided what I was, and nothing I said was going to change that. 8 months later, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the incident report. It took 4 months to get it. When I finally read it, I wasn't surprised. The language was careful, clinical, designed to close a file rather than investigate a phenomenon. Environmental exposure and possible psychological episode brought on by isolation. That was the official conclusion. That's what happened to Dale Everett in the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest in September of 2019. Not an encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Not evidence of an intelligence operating in territory it had claimed for itself. Just a man who couldn't handle being alone in the woods. There was one more thing, though. One detail I noticed in the FOIA documents that nobody mentioned during my hospitalization. The ranger who extracted me, the one whose partner had muttered "another one" before being silenced, Was transferred to a desk position in Boise 2 weeks after my rescue. No explanation given. No disciplinary action on record. Just a quiet reassignment away from the field. Away from whatever it was he knew about that drainage and the people who came out of it. I tried to contact him. Left messages, sent letters. He never responded. He knows something. They all know something. And they're never going to admit it. Let me show you what survived. I'm pulling out a folder here. You can see it on camera. Inside are the only pieces of physical evidence I managed to bring back from the deadfall. Everything else was destroyed or left behind. My GPS stomped flat. My satellite phone bitten in half. My primary camera's memory card corrupted beyond recovery. The trail camera I'd set up turned to face a tree trunk, its footage showing nothing but bark and shadow. But some things made it through. First, the photographs on my phone. The backup images I took during those first few days, before everything went wrong. Most of them show exactly what you'd expect from a surveying job. Terrain features, measurement markers, the kind of documentation that would be useful for a utility corridor assessment. There are a few shots of the 17-inch footprint I found in the creek mud, though the resolution isn't great, and the dermal ridges are hard to see unless you know what you're looking for. And then there's this one. I'm holding it up to the camera now. I've had it printed because I've looked at it so many times on my phone that I needed to see it on paper, needed to study it in a format I could hold in my hands. It's a shot of the tree line at the edge of a clearing. I took it on day 5, or at least I think I did. The timestamp says I took it, though I don't remember doing it. The lighting is dim, late afternoon. The focus is slightly off, like I accidentally triggered the camera while adjusting my grip. In the background, partially obscured by a thick cedar trunk, there's something standing. A dark mass. Taller than the surrounding brush. Roughly humanoid in shape, but the proportions are wrong. Too broad across the shoulders, too long in the arms. It might be a shadow. It might be a trick of light and bark patterns creating a shape where none exists. The resolution falls apart when you zoom in, dissolving into pixels that could mean anything or nothing. The Forest Service analyst who reviewed this image called it a lens artifact. Case closed. But I was there. I know what I photographed. And I know what's been following me through my nightmares every night for the past 18 months. Second piece of evidence, my medical records. I have copies here. Hospital admission reports, surgical notes, physical therapy assessments. They document everything that happened to my body during those 6 weeks in Lewiston. The dehydration, the hypothermia, the 3 fingers I lost to frostbite. The records also document what the doctors couldn't explain. The frostbite damage was inconsistent with my exposure time and the ambient temperatures. My core temperature when I was admitted suggested prolonged cold exposure that shouldn't have been possible in September conditions. There were abrasions on my arms and legs that looked like I'd been restrained or grabbed, though I have no memory of physical contact. The doctors noted these anomalies. They documented them carefully, and then they moved on, because unexplained doesn't mean investigated. It just means unexplained. Third, the FOIA documents. The incident report itself is 7 pages of careful bureaucratic language designed to say nothing while appearing to say something. But there are other documents in the file. Internal memos, email chains, a log of similar incidents in the same general area going back almost 15 years. 15 years, dozens of reports, hikers who came out disoriented and couldn't remember what happened to them, hunters who abandoned their camps and fled the area in the middle of the night. Surveyors, like me, who were found in states of severe distress with injuries that didn't match their reported experiences. None of these incidents were ever investigated. None of them were ever connected. Each one was documented, filed, and forgotten, treated as an isolated occurrence rather than part of a pattern. And 3 weeks ago, I learned why I'm recording this. I found out that the Forest Service had quietly approved the same utility corridor for a new survey team. Same drainage, same 12-day timeline, same helicopter drop with no ground vehicle access. They're scheduled to begin work this spring, and nothing in their briefing materials mentions what happened to the last surveyor who went into that territory. Nothing mentions the 17-inch tracks or the geometric log arrangements, or the screaming vocalizations that echoed across the drainage at dusk. Nothing mentions the figures that stood motionless in the darkness, watching, waiting, enforcing boundaries that no official map acknowledges. They're sending another crew into the deadfall, and they're sending them blind. That's why I'm talking. That's why I'm showing you this folder full of ambiguous evidence and unexplained medical records and carefully worded government documents. Not because I think anyone will believe me. Not because I think I can prove what lives in those woods. But because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand that there are places in this country where we are not welcome, where something older and stranger than us has claimed the territory and has ways of making that very clear. And I need to warn whoever's going in next. I'm going to end this recording the same way I started it, by telling you that I don't expect you to believe me, but I need you to listen anyway. If you're part of that new survey crew scheduled for the deadfall drainage this spring, if you're the helicopter pilot who's going to drop them on that ridgeline, if you're the contract coordinator who's going to make that scheduled radio check every evening at 1900 hours, I need you to understand something. That drainage belongs to something else, not to the Forest Service, not to the utility company, not to us. I've spent the past 18 months trying to understand what happened to me out there. I've read everything I could find about territorial behavior in primates. I've studied indigenous accounts of forest giants and avoided territories. I've talked to anthropologists and wildlife biologists and anyone else who might have an explanation that doesn't require me to accept that I encountered something science refuses to acknowledge. And here's what I've learned. It doesn't matter what we call them. It doesn't matter whether they're an undocumented primate species or something else entirely. What matters is that they're intelligent, they're territorial, and they have methods of enforcement that are both sophisticated and terrifying. They herded me for 6 days before they made direct contact. 6 days of blocked trails and geometric warnings and escalating pressure, giving me every opportunity to leave on my own terms. When I didn't, when I tried to document them, when I became a threat rather than just a trespasser, they showed me exactly what they were capable of. I lost 3 fingers in September when the temperatures never dropped below 50 degrees. The doctors can't explain it. The Forest Service won't investigate it. But I know what happened in that hunter's blind, when something stood outside breathing in the darkness and my fingers turned the color of candle wax. They could have killed me. I understand that now. Whatever stood around my tent that night on day 6, whatever pursued me through those woods for 3 days after, they could have ended it at any time. The fact that I'm sitting here recording this testimony means they chose not to. I don't know why. Mercy, maybe. Or indifference. Or maybe they wanted me to survive so I could deliver exactly this message to whoever comes next. Stay out. The new survey crew has families. They have lives and careers and futures that don't include what's waiting for them in that drainage. Someone needs to cancel that contract. Someone needs to find a different route for that utility corridor. Someone needs to acknowledge that there are places in this wilderness where the cost of progress is too high. But I know they won't. I know this recording is going to be filed away, or dismissed, or never seen by anyone who has the power to make that decision. I know that crew is going to get dropped on that same ridgeline where I stood 18 months ago, and they're going to walk into territory that's been claimed by something that doesn't negotiate. So if you're part of that crew, if you're reading this somehow, if someone shows you this testimony before you board that helicopter, pay attention to the warnings the locals give you. Pay attention to the silence when the forest goes quiet. Pay attention to the tracks and the smells and the blocked trails. And if you wake up one night and see silhouettes standing motionless around your tent, if you hear that mechanical scream echoing across the drainage at dusk, if your equipment starts getting destroyed in ways that feel deliberate, get out, immediately. Don't wait. Don't document it. Don't try to understand it. Just leave while you still can. Because I didn't. And I'm recording this from a storage unit in Boise with 3 missing fingers and nightmares that haven't stopped in 18 months, trying to warn people who probably won't listen. The deadfall earned its name. Remember that. This is Dale Everett, September 12th, 2020. End of testimony.